The defining moment for the G7 lies in how it has evolved to tackle the challenges of an interconnected world, problems that no single nation can solve on its own. From climate change to global health crises, the G7 has stepped up to confront issues that transcend borders. Think about the COVID-19 pandemic. It was the G7 that took early steps to ensure vaccine equity through programs like COVAX, aiming to reach the most vulnerable nations. While far from perfect, it was a significant move to demonstrate solidarity in the face of a global emergency. Think of the G7 as an exclusive club, 7 of the world's most powerful nations sitting around a table, deciding on issues that affect billions of people. But why these 7? What makes them so influential? And what happens in those high-stakes meetings? Today, we're breaking it all down. Who they are, what they do, and why their decisions matter more than you realize. Here's the thing. While the G7 claims to champion global stability, they've also faced criticism, big time. Critics argue that this elite group often ignores the voices of developing nations and focuses on their own interests. So, is the G7 a force for good, or is it just a power play by the richest countries? To answer that, we need to dig deep into their history, their role in today's world, and the controversies surrounding them. Let's start with the basics. What is the G7, and who are its members? The G7 stands for the Group of 7, comprising the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan. These nations represent some of the largest advanced economies in the world. Together, they account for around 40% of global GDP and 10% of the world's population. But here's the kicker. The G7 isn't a formal institution. There's no headquarters, no permanent staff, and no binding agreements. It's more like an informal gathering of leaders, presidents, prime ministers, and top officials who meet annually to discuss pressing global issues. While the G7's format might seem informal, the outcomes of these meetings are anything but. The group's communiques, official statements released after each summit, often set the tone for international policies on issues ranging from trade to climate change. These documents, though non-binding, influence the actions of other nations and organizations, like the United Nations and the World Bank. For instance, G7 leaders have repeatedly emphasized the importance of multilateralism, which contrasts sharply with the more nationalistic approaches of some other global powers. The G7 was born in the 1970s during a period of economic turmoil. Back then, the world faced an oil crisis and a financial downturn. The leaders of 6 countries, the US, UK, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan, decided to meet in 1975 to coordinate their economic policies. Canada joined a year later and voila, the G7 was formed. Fun fact, Russia was added in the 1990s, making it the G8 for a while. But after the annexation of Crimea in 2014, Russia was booted out and the group reverted to the G7. The first summit was held in Rambouillet, France, and was initially intended as a one-time event. However, the success of this gathering led to the establishment of an annual tradition. Over the years, the G7's agenda expanded beyond economic issues to encompass a wide array of global challenges. From combating terrorism to addressing public health crises, the G7 has evolved to reflect the changing priorities of the international community. What does the G7 do? Here's where it gets interesting. The G7 isn't just about economics anymore. Over the years, its agenda has expanded to include climate change, global health, security, and more. Remember the Paris Agreement on climate change? The G7 played a pivotal role in its negotiation. During the COVID-19 pandemic, they pledged billions of dollars for vaccine distribution. But here's the flip side. Many argue that these actions often serve the interests of G7 nations rather than the global good. For example, their climate initiatives have been criticized for not providing enough support to developing nations most affected by climate change. One notable example of the G7's impact is its role in debt relief for developing countries. In the early 2000s, the G7 led efforts to forgive billions of dollars in debt owed by some of the world's poorest nations. This initiative, known as the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries (IPC) program, aimed to free up resources for social and economic development in these countries. While the program had its limitations, it demonstrated the G7's capacity to mobilize collective action on a global scale. The power dynamics within the G7, not all G7 members are equal. The US often takes the lead, given its economic and military dominance. Germany and Japan, as industrial powerhouses, also wield significant influence. Meanwhile, Canada and Italy are sometimes seen as junior partners. This uneven power dynamic can lead to tensions. For instance, during the Trump administration, the U.S. often clashed with other G7 members on issues like trade and climate change. The influence of individual leaders also plays a crucial role in shaping the G7's direction. Charismatic figures like Angela Merkel, Emmanuel Macron, and Justin Trudeau have used their platforms to advocate for specific issues, from gender equality to digital transformation. These personal dynamics add an intriguing layer to the G7's operations, making each summit a unique event shaped by the personalities in the room. G7 versus G20, what's the difference? You might be wondering, isn't there already a G20? And you're right, the G20 includes the G7 nations plus 13 others, representing both developed and developing countries. The G20's broader membership gives it more legitimacy on global issues, but the G7 remains influential because it's smaller, more cohesive, and often sets the stage for G20 discussions. Think of the G7 as the inner circle and the G20 as the bigger meeting. Another key difference lies in the decision-making process. The G7's smaller size allows for more informal and flexible discussions, enabling quicker consensus on pressing issues. In contrast, the G20's larger and more diverse membership often leads to lengthy negotiations and compromises. This distinction highlights the complementary roles of the two groups in addressing global challenges. Criticisms and controversies. The G7 has faced its share of criticism. Developing countries often accuse it of being a rich nations club that overlooks the needs of the global South. Activists have also called out the G7 for its slow action on climate change and inequality. For example, while the G7 has pledged to phase out fossil fuels, their countries continue to invest heavily in oil and gas projects. Hypocrisy? Many think so. Another area of contention is the G7's handling of global trade. Critics argue that its policies often prioritize the interests of multinational corporations over those of workers and local communities. For instance, G7-backed trade agreements have sometimes been accused of undermining labor rights and environmental protections in favor of corporate profits. This tension underscores the complex interplay between economic growth and social equity in the G7's decision-making, expanding the scope of the G7's influence. Beyond its traditional focus areas, the G7 has increasingly engaged in addressing technological advancements and cybersecurity. In recent years, the group has called for greater regulation of tech giants to ensure data privacy and curb misinformation. They've also emphasized the importance of international cooperation in securing critical infrastructure against cyber attacks. This evolving agenda reflects the G7's recognition of the need to adapt to a rapidly changing world. By addressing emerging challenges, the group aims to remain relevant and effective in promoting global stability. However, critics argue that the G7's efforts in these areas often fall short of their ambitious goals, highlighting the need for more concrete actions and measurable outcomes. The role of civil society in shaping the G7's agenda, an often overlooked aspect of the G7, is the role of civil society organizations, CSOs, in influencing its priorities. Through advocacy campaigns, research reports, and direct engagement with policymakers, CSOs play a crucial role in ensuring that the G7's decisions align with the broader public interest. For instance, environmental groups have successfully pushed for greater commitments to renewable energy and conservation efforts. The involvement of civil society highlights the importance of transparency and accountability in the G7's operations. By fostering dialogue between governments, CSOs, and the public, the G7 can enhance its legitimacy and effectiveness in addressing global challenges. This collaborative approach also underscores the interconnectedness of modern governance, where no single entity can tackle complex issues in isolation. Climax key moment. The real turning point for the G7 came when they started tackling modern, borderless challenges. Things like climate change, digital security, and global health. Remember the global pandemic? The G7 was one of the first groups to strategize vaccine distribution to low-income countries through initiatives like COVAX. Sure, it wasn't flawless, but it was a step toward showing how powerful nations can unite to address crises that affect everyone, not just their citizens. And then there's climate action. The G7's pledge to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050 is ambitious, yes, but necessary. They've committed to financing renewable energy projects in developing countries and phasing out coal dependency. These aren't just political promises, they're declarations of responsibility in a world that's watching them closely. But here's the kicker. The G7 isn't just about agreements behind closed doors. It's a platform for setting the tone of global conversations. When G7 nations speak out against injustices, like condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine, they're not just flexing their influence, they're creating a ripple effect. Their unified stance often pressures other nations and organizations to act. The key moment that defines the G7 isn't any single meeting or policy. It's the idea that, despite criticism and limitations, this group still holds the power to drive global change. When they choose to rise above individual interests, whether it's protecting democratic values, fostering global economic stability, or responding to humanitarian crises. The G7 has proven that collaboration, even among competing powers, can achieve what isolated efforts cannot.
And if you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content like this. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss any future uploads. Let's keep spreading positivity and building a happier life together. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.